She was 75 years old, standing on her own front porch with one suitcase at her feet, watching her three children divide her furniture between a donation truck and a dumpster. Not a storage unit, not a garage, a dumpster. Her oldest son was checking his watch. Her daughter was on her phone. And somewhere inside the house, she had kept clean and warm for 22 years. Strangers in work gloves were deciding that the quilt she had sewn by hand over 3 winters was not worth saving. Dorothy Callahan had spent her entire adult life being told that her patience was her greatest virtue. That patience she was about to discover had been a kind of silence. And silence, she had finally learned, was exactly what the people who wronged you were counting on. What her children did not know, what nobody in Millhaven, Virginia had known for 40 years, was that Dorothy's grandmother had left her something in a locked root cellar on an abandoned property 3 miles from town. Not money, not jewelry, something far more dangerous to the people who had spent 4 decades counting on Dorothy's silence. Letters, evidence, the kind of truth that does not age, does not soften, and does not forgive being buried. By the time the sun set that evening, Dorothy Callahan would have read every word. And by the following Sunday morning, the most respected man in Millhaven would be publicly confessing to a lie he had told in 1984 that had stolen her reputation, her wedding, and 40 years of the dignity she was owed. Stay with this story, because what happens when a woman who has genuinely nothing left to lose finally opens a door that was locked for her protection? It will change the way you think about patience, about truth, and about what we owe the people we love. Dorothy had not been born into a life that asked much of her in the way of drama. She had been raised quietly, the eldest of 2 daughters, in a modest house in Millhaven by parents who believed that hard work and good character were sufficient armor against whatever the world might send your way. Her father had been a high school history teacher. Her mother had taken in sewing to supplement their income. And it was her mother who had first put a needle in Dorothy's hands when she was 7 years old, teaching her the particular satisfaction of making something precise and lasting out of raw material. Dorothy had grown up to be a seamstress of real skill, not a hobbyist, a professional with a small alteration shop on Crescent Street that she had run for 30 years with the kind of quiet competence that earned loyal customers but rarely drew attention to itself. She had been content with that. She had never wanted to be remarkable. She had wanted to be good at her work and kind to the people around her and loved by the man she intended to marry. That man had been Frank Callahan. Frank had come into her shop in the autumn of 1983 to have a dress shirt altered for his niece's engagement dinner. He was 43, a widower, a carpenter whose hands were always slightly calloused, and whose voice had the unhurried quality of someone who had learned that most problems resolve themselves if you didn't panic at them. Dorothy had been 36. She had been alone for a long time, for reasons she had learned not to discuss in public. They had talked during the fitting. He had come back the following week with another shirt and less reason to be there, and they had both understood that the shirt was not really the point. He proposed on a Tuesday evening in January, sitting in her small kitchen with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched because he was too nervous to drink it. She said yes before he finished the sentence. She had been waiting for something like this for a long time, and she recognized it when it arrived. They set the wedding for June of 1984. Millhaven Community Church, the large white steepled building on the square that had anchored this town's social life for 100 years. The invitations were printed. The flowers were ordered. Dorothy made her own dress. Ivory silk with a fitted bodice and long sleeves that ended in delicate points at the wrist, the most careful and loving piece of work she had ever done. And then Reverend Gerald Holt decided that he could not allow the wedding to take place. Reverend Holt was 40 years old in the spring of 1984. He was tall, well-dressed, possessed of the particular magnetism that certain men develop when they discover early that their voice and their confidence can move a room. He had led Millhaven Community Church for 8 years and had in that time made himself indispensable to the town's social architecture, chairing charitable committees, counseling families in crisis, appearing at every important occasion with the reliable warmth of someone who understood that presence was its own form of power. Dorothy had first noticed his attention during the pre-wedding counseling sessions that the church required of all couples who married there. Compliments that lasted a beat too long. A hand on her arm when a nod would have served. A look that she recognized, had learned through difficult experience to recognize, as something that had nothing to do with pastoral guidance. She had mentioned it to no one. Not Frank, who would have been furious and might have done something that ended badly. Not her mother, who worried too much already. She had simply tried to keep distance between herself and the Reverend, hoping that her clear and consistent unavailability would communicate itself. It communicated nothing. It only made him angrier. 3 weeks before the wedding, Reverend Holt called a private meeting with 3 of the church's senior elders. Dorothy did not learn what was said in that meeting until years later, when one of the elders, a man named Charles Webb, who died of a stroke in 2002, told Frank on his own deathbed that he had always regretted what he had done. Holt had told them, with tears and visible reluctance, that Dorothy Callahan had come to his office and made a proposition that had shocked and disturbed him, that she had expressed what he called an inappropriate attachment, that he had refused her firmly, that he felt it was his duty to inform them before she married an innocent man in their church. The elders had believed him without question. Of course they had. He was her shepherd. She was a seamstress with a past that people whispered about. Whispered, she would understand only later, because Holt himself had been whispering about it for months before the wedding, seeding the ground for exactly this moment. Within 48 hours, the story had traveled through Millhaven the way such stories travel in small towns. Faster than any newspaper, louder than any announcement, impossible to retract once released. The wedding was canceled by the church. Frank's family, who were pillars of the congregation, were horrified. His sister called Dorothy unstable. His mother told Frank that if he married her anyway, she would not attend and would not forgive him. Frank had believed Dorothy. He had looked at her across her kitchen table. Hearing the story, she was too shaken to tell without her voice breaking, and he had said without hesitation, "I know you. I know what kind of person you are." I don't care what he said. They married at the county courthouse on a Thursday afternoon in July, with Dorothy's grandmother Nana Rose and one friend as witnesses. No flowers, no dress. She could not bring herself to wear the one she had made for the church wedding. They went to a diner afterward and ate hamburgers and held hands across the table and tried to pretend that the wedding they had wanted had not been taken from them by a man whose vanity had been wounded. They had 30 years after that. 30 years of building a life together in Millhaven while remaining always slightly outside its social center. Frank built furniture and repaired houses. Dorothy ran her shop. They raised 3 children. They were, as often as possible, happy. But Millhaven remembered. Millhaven always remembered. And their children grew up hearing, in the background of their entire childhoods, the low, persistent hum of their mother's reputation. That woman, the one who went after the pastor, the scandalous story that people told newcomers as a piece of local color, never imagining that the woman's children were in the room. Frank died of cancer 11 years ago. Dorothy had nursed him through it with the same steady, precise care she brought to everything. After he was gone, she had stayed in a house they had rented for 22 years from an elderly landlord named Walter Grimes, who had told her she could stay as long as she needed and had meant it because Walter Grimes was one of the genuinely good people Dorothy had been lucky enough to know. Walter died 8 months ago. His daughter, who lived in Denver and had visited Millhaven perhaps 4 times in her adult life, sold the property immediately to a developer. Dorothy had no formal lease. She had no legal standing. She had only the memory of a promise made by a man who was no longer alive to honor it. Her children could have helped. They had the means. Edward was a contract attorney. Patricia worked in healthcare administration. James ran a landscaping business that had done well enough to buy him a house twice the size he needed. They had the resources and They had the connections, and they had, or should have had, the obligation. Instead, they called a family meeting and explained to Dorothy that it was probably for the best. The morning they came to supervise her removal was the 5th of October, a weekday, clear and cold with the particular sharpness that Virginia autumns sometimes produce. Dorothy had been up since 5. She had made coffee. She had folded what she could fold and packed what could be packed, and sat in her kitchen for an hour doing nothing, because there was nothing left that needed doing. Edward arrived first. He was 50, her oldest, a man who had his father's jaw and none of his father's warmth. He came through the door, already looking at his phone, already in the mode of a person processing a logistical problem rather than visiting his mother. "The truck comes at 9, he said. "Try to have everything by the door." Patricia arrived 20 minutes later. She was 48, competent and brisk, and always slightly impatient with situations she considered inefficient. She kissed Dorothy's cheek without quite making contact, and immediately began moving through the rooms with the practiced eye of someone assessing what was worth keeping and what wasn't. James was last. He was 45 and in many ways the kindest of the three, which meant he was the one who looked most uncomfortable and said the least. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen and didn't quite meet his mother's eyes. "Where am I supposed to go?" Dorothy asked. She had asked the question before in different conversations over the past 3 months. She asked it now without accusation, simply as a woman who needed a practical answer that had not yet been provided. "Mom," Patricia set down the vase she had been examining. "We've been over this. There are facilities. The facilities have waiting lists," Dorothy said. "I've told you this. 9 months minimum at every one within reasonable distance. I showed you the letters. Then you need to go somewhere in the interim," Edward said, his voice carrying the flat patience of a man who has decided the conversation is an obstacle between him and his schedule. "A motel, a friend's house. There are options. A motel costs money I don't have, and my friends are 75 years old and live in small apartments," Dorothy said. "Edward, I am your mother. I am being put out of my home because of a legal technicality and a landlord's daughter who has never met me. Are you genuinely telling me that your solution is a motel?" "We don't have room," Patricia said, and the way she said it, quickly, as if the words had been prepared, told Dorothy that this sentence had been agreed upon in advance, perhaps in a phone call between the three of them where her situation had been discussed and resolved without her. "We've all talked about it. Michael has the new baby. I travel constantly. Edward's house. Linda doesn't want a long-term guest," Edward finished. "We're not trying to be cruel, Mom. We're being realistic." Dorothy looked at her children. She looked at them the way she had looked at every piece of work she had ever done, honestly, without the distortion of wishful thinking. What she saw was not cruelty exactly. It was something in some ways worse than cruelty. It was convenience. They had decided that her situation was inconvenient, and they had arranged their feelings around that decision rather than the other way around. "I have somewhere to go," she said. They looked at her. Nana Rose's old property, out on the Whitfield Road. The house burned down 15 years ago, but the root cellar is still there, built into the hillside. I can stay there while I sort things out. The look the three of them exchanged was the look of people who have just heard something that confirms a suspicion they had been too polite to voice. James was the one who spoke, and he said it gently, which somehow made it worse. "Mom, that place has been empty since the fire. There's no electricity, no water." "I know what there is and isn't," Dorothy said. "I'm not asking your opinion. I'm telling you where I'll be." She picked up her suitcase. It was the old one, the one with the broken wheel that she had been meaning to replace for 2 years and never had. She walked to the door. Behind her, she heard Edward say something to Patricia in a low voice. She heard the word dramatic. She did not turn around. She walked down her porch steps and onto the sidewalk and kept walking. 3 miles to the old Whitfield Road property. She walked it in just over an hour, the suitcase dragging, the October air cold enough that her breath made small clouds, the trees along the road in their last extravagant color before the gray set in. She thought about Nana Rose, who had died 22 years ago at the age of 91, who had been the most honest person Dorothy had ever known, and who had pressed a small brass key in her palm on the last day of her life with an urgency that Dorothy had attributed to the confusion of dying. "The root cellar," Nana Rose had said, her voice barely audible, but her grip surprisingly strong. "When you have nothing left, Dorothy, when they've taken everything and you're standing in the dark, go to the root cellar. I left you something that will help you. Promise me you'll remember where it is." Dorothy had promised, holding her grandmother's hand and thinking it was the kind of thing a person said at the end. Not meaningless, but not to be taken as a literal instruction. She had kept the key because it had been her grandmother's, not because she expected to use it. She had been wrong about that. The property had a different quality to it than she remembered from childhood. The house was gone entirely. Fire had taken it, and nature had taken the rest. The concrete foundation, now so thoroughly colonized by vegetation that it was barely distinguishable from the hillside. But the root cellar, built into the slope behind where the house had stood, was exactly as she remembered it. The heavy wooden door was weathered gray and sealed with a rusted padlock that looked like it had not been touched in decades. Dorothy set down her suitcase. She reached into her coat pocket and found the key, which she had carried on the same key ring as her house and shop keys for 22 years without ever consciously thinking about why. She fitted it to the padlock. The rust fought her. She worked the key back and forth, both hands, all her remaining strength, feeling her 60-plus years of seamstress work in the precision of her fingers, even now. The lock gave with a sound like something being freed rather than broken. The door was harder. Moisture had swollen the wood and warped the frame over decades of seasons. Dorothy braced herself against the hillside and pulled with everything she had, and the door tore open on the third attempt with a groan of old timber surrendering. Cold air came out first, the particular cold of underground spaces, earth smell, and old wood. And beneath that, something she recognized immediately and could not have explained if asked: the faint ghost of lavender. Nana Rose had kept lavender sachets in everything. The smell had followed her everywhere, had perfumed her clothes and her linens, and apparently, impossibly, had survived locked in this hillside for 22 years. Dorothy turned on the small flashlight she kept in her coat pocket and stepped inside. The root cellar was larger than she remembered from the one or two times Nana Rose had brought her here as a child. The curved stone ceiling was intact. The timber beams were sound. The shelf along the walls held the remnants of what had once been a careful domestic archive. Old mason jars, their contents long since gone, a few rusted tools, dust and cobwebs over everything. But the back wall, visible in her flashlight beam as clearly as if it had been placed there yesterday, sat a trunk. Not a modern trunk. A proper old-fashioned hope chest, dark oak with brass fittings, the kind that people in another era brought with them when they came to a new country carrying their most precious things. Dorothy knew this trunk. She had seen it in Nana Rose's bedroom for the first 20 years of her life, before Nana Rose had eventually moved it, as she explained it, somewhere safer. Dorothy crossed the room slowly, the flashlight steady in her hand, her breath visible in the cold air. The trunk was sealed with a wax seal, old red wax, undisturbed, with a small cameo ring pressed into it. Nana Rose's cameo. The one she had worn every day of Dorothy's childhood. The one she had been buried without because, Dorothy now understood, she had removed it beforehand and pressed it into this seal herself, deliberately, specifically. Dorothy stood in front of the trunk for a long moment. She was 75 years old, standing in her grandmother's root cellar with a broken suitcase behind her and no home to return to. She had nothing left to be afraid of losing. She broke the seal. The lid opened smoothly on hinges that had been well made. That was Nana Rose's way, to do things properly or not at all. Inside, preserved in layers of tissue paper and the dried remnants of lavender sachets that had kept the air sweet for 2 decades, was a wedding dress. Ivory silk with a fitted bodice and long sleeves that ended in delicate points at the wrist. Dorothy said the words aloud, softly, recognizing them as the description she had given Frank when she explained what she was making 40 years ago in the months before the wedding that never happened. Her wedding dress, the one she had made herself and then locked away after the courthouse ceremony because she could not look at it. The one she had eventually told herself she had donated just to stop thinking about it. Nana Rose had taken it, had preserved it, had sealed it away with the cameo ring like a sacrament. Dorothy lifted the dress with hands that had not lost their gentleness in 40 years. The silk was still beautiful. Time had mellowed the ivory to a soft, warm white, but the fabric had held, the lace was intact, the careful work of her younger self was all there, every stitch. She held it against herself for a moment, eyes closed. Then she felt it, the stiffness in the bodice lining that should not have been there. She knew fabric the way a doctor knows the human body, by touch alone, and this was wrong. The lining was doubled in a way she had not made it. She turned the dress over with her flashlight, examining the seams. There, in the bodice, a section of stitching that was not hers, careful, skilled work, but a different hand, a different thread. Someone had opened the lining and re-sewn it after she had finished the dress. Dorothy reached into her suitcase and found her small sewing kit. She never traveled without it, and with scissors and steady fingers, opened the false seam. 3 envelopes tumbled into her lap. The first envelope was postmarked August of 1984, addressed to Rose Whitaker in a handwriting Dorothy did not recognize, small, precise, slightly uneven with what looked like nervousness. She unfolded the letter inside with both hands. "Dear Mrs. Whitaker," it began, "I am writing because I cannot continue to carry what I know in silence, even though I am too frightened to speak it publicly where it might do any actual good. My name is Margaret Fowler. I was the administrative secretary at Millhaven Community Church for 14 years, including the spring of 1984. I was in the office on the afternoon that Reverend Holt claims Dorothy Callahan came to him and behaved inappropriately. I know what actually happened because I was there in the adjacent room with the door slightly open, as I often worked in the evenings when the church was quiet. Reverend Holt called Miss Callahan into his office. He made the appointment himself, told me to arrange it under the pretense of wedding planning details. I heard his voice through the wall. I had heard that particular tone before with other women over the years, and I recognized it for what it was. I heard Miss Callahan respond firmly, clearly, without hesitation. I heard her tell him she was engaged and leaving. I heard her leave quickly. He was visibly angry when he came out of his office. Within an hour, he was on the telephone with Elder Raymond Crawford, and I heard him say things that were the exact opposite of what I knew to be true. He was calm and practiced. He had clearly thought about what he was going to say before he said it. I wanted desperately to correct this. I composed letters to the elders. I drafted a statement. But my husband, Harold, worked at the time for a construction company whose primary contract was with the church's development committee, which Reverend Holt personally chaired. When I told Harold what I intended to do, he told me I would be destroying our family security over a matter that was none of our business. He wasn't wrong that the consequence would be severe. Reverend Holt had that kind of power. I am ashamed of myself, Mrs. Whitaker. I am deeply, permanently ashamed. Your granddaughter is innocent of everything she has been accused of. What she has been accused of, Holt actually did to her. I know this because I witnessed it, and I'm too afraid to say, so where it will do any good. Please tell her, somehow, that at least one person knows the truth. I am sorry I cannot be braver than I am. Yours in shame, Margaret Fowler." Dorothy read the letter twice. Then she sat very still in the cold and the dark with the letter in her hands. The second envelope was postmarked September of 1984, a different handwriting entirely. Larger, more expansive, a man's hand. The letter inside was 2 pages. Dear Rose, I don't know if I have any right to write to you. We have been acquaintances for 30 years, but I have never been a man who found it easy to admit to wrongdoing. And what I am about to tell you is about my own cowardice as much as anything else. My name is Arthur Payne. I have run Payne Hardware on Jefferson Street for 25 years. I mention this because it's relevant to why I failed to do what I should have done. In the spring of 1984, on an evening in late April, I was walking through the church parking lot after working late at my store. I took that route regularly as a shortcut to my car. On this particular evening, I saw Reverend Holt following Dorothy Callahan, the young woman who ran the alteration shop on Crescent Street, to her vehicle. She was walking quickly. He was catching up to her. I stopped because something about the scene made me uneasy. I watched him position himself between her and her car door. I saw him touch her arm when she tried to step around him. I saw her move his hand away. I watched this happen more than once before she was finally able to get into her car and drive away. And he stood in the parking lot watching her go with an expression I can only describe as proprietary anger. This was 3 weeks before the scandal became public. When I heard what he claimed she had done to him, I understood immediately that the truth was exactly the reverse. I told my wife. She told me to stay out of it. She said we had business dealings with half the families in that church congregation, and that involving ourselves in a dispute between the pastor and a woman most people in town were already suspicious of was, and this is what she actually said, financial suicide. I have thought about Dorothy Callahan many times over the years. I have seen her in town. I have watched her live with a reputation she never deserved, and I have walked past her on the street without saying anything because I did not want to disturb a life I had convinced myself was stable. I have told myself she seemed fine, that she and Frank were happy enough, that there was nothing to be done about the past. These are the stories we tell ourselves to live with our cowardice, Rose. I know you understand that. I am sending this letter because I want there to be a record somewhere that tells the truth. Even if I cannot say it publicly, I want it written down and given to someone who loves her, in case it is ever needed. Dorothy Callahan is an innocent woman who was wronged by a powerful man who could not bear to be refused. And I was one of the people who could have stopped it and didn't. I'm sorry. I am genuinely, permanently sorry. Arthur Payne. Dorothy held that letter for a long time. She was looking at the ceiling of the root cellar, at the old stone and the timber beams, without really seeing them. She was thinking about Arthur Payne, who had died perhaps 8 years ago, whose hardware store was now a yoga studio, who had watched her walk past him on Jefferson Street dozens of times over the years while carrying this in his chest. She thought about Margaret Fowler, who had sat in a church office and heard everything and gone home that evening and made dinner for her husband Harold, and put the children to bed and said nothing. She thought about Nana Rose, who had received these letters and had not come to her immediately, and she thought she already knew why. She opened the 3rd envelope. It was larger than the others, addressed in handwriting she recognized the way you recognize a family member's voice. Not because you think about it, but because it is simply known. My darling Dorothy. It began in Nana Rose's clear, deliberate script. If you're reading this, then something has gone very wrong with your life, and you have finally done what I asked you to do 50 years ago. I'm sorry for whatever brought you here. I hope it is not too terrible. But I confess that a part of me, a part that knew you better than anyone, always suspected you would eventually need what I hid in this trunk. I received Margaret Fowler's letter in August of 1984. 6 weeks after your courthouse wedding. I received Arthur Payne's letter a month after that. I read them both, and I wept for a full day, which I have never told anyone, and which I mention now, because I want you to know how much your suffering hurt me, how much I would have given to undo what was done to you. When I had composed myself, I made appointments with 2 of the church elders. I planned to present this evidence, demand a public acknowledgement of the truth, forced Gerald Holt to answer for what he had done. I was 72 years old, and I was not afraid of him, and I intended to be very clear about that. He came to my house before I could follow through. I still do not know precisely how he found out. The town was small, and he had friends in many places. He came alone on a weekday afternoon when I was in the garden, and he stood at my fence, and he spoke to me in the pleasant, reasonable voice of a man who has learned that a pleasant, reasonable voice is more frightening than a raised one. He told me that if I used those letters publicly, if I attempted to damage his reputation or challenge his word to the elders, he would ensure that your life in Millhaven became completely untenable. He was specific about how he had connections with the families whose patronage kept your alteration shop in business. He sat on the board of the Millhaven Business Association. He could, he explained, very easily make it impossible for you to earn a living in this county. And he could spread rumors that would be worse than the ones that already existed. He was, Dorothy, a genuinely frightening man when he chose to be. I believe him completely. And you had just married Frank, and you were trying so hard to build something decent out of what had been taken from you. I thought, perhaps I was wrong. I have never been entirely sure. I thought that protecting you meant protecting the fragile new life you were building, even if it cost you the vindication you deserved. So I put the letters away. I sewed them into the lining of your wedding dress, and I locked them in this cellar. And I told myself I was keeping them safe for a moment that might never come. And then I asked you to remember the key. I failed you in the way that people fail each other out of love rather than indifference, which is its own category of failure, and I think in some ways the hardest to forgive. I wanted to protect you, and I protected you from the wrong thing. I protected you from conflict when what you needed was truth. I do not know as I write this, and I am writing it on what I suspect are my last genuinely clear-headed days, whether Gerald Holt is still alive when you find these letters. I hope, if he is, that he has lived 40 years with the particular weight of knowing exactly what he did. I hope it has been heavy. But here's what I want you to do, my darling girl, regardless of whether he is living or dead, regardless of whether the people who believe his lie are still in Millhaven or gone to wherever people go. I want you to tell the truth, publicly, clearly, with evidence in your hand and your head held the way you always hold it when you're doing something that matters. I want you to speak it out loud in a place where people can hear it, because the truth was denied a public hearing 40 years ago, and it is owed one. Not for revenge. I am not leaving you these letters so that you can destroy Gerald Holt, though he arguably deserves destruction. I am leaving them so that you can stand in your own name, clearly and without shame, in front of the town that whispered about you for 40 years and say, I was telling the truth. I was always telling the truth. You deserve that. You have always deserved that. Use these letters. Use your voice. Make them listen. I love you more than I have ever managed to say adequately. I am so sorry I was not braver when bravery would have cost me something real. But I tried, in the way I knew how, to leave you what you needed. All my love, always. Your Nana Rose. Dorothy sat in that root cellar for a long time after reading her grandmother's letter. She sat with the wedding dress across her lap and the 3 letters spread on the old trunk lid and the flashlight casting its small, steady circle of light, and she let herself feel all of it. The grief for 40 years of undeserved shame, the love for a grandmother who had preserved truth as carefully as she had preserved silk, the complicated anger at the people who had known and stayed silent, and the larger, more complicated anger at the one man who had made their silence necessary. And then, because she was Dorothy Callahan, who had been doing precise and difficult work under pressure for 50 years, she began to think practically about what needed to happen next. Gerald Holt was 78 years old. She knew this from occasional pieces of local news that still reached her. A retirement announcement from the church 12 years ago, a photograph in the Millhaven Courier at some charitable event. He was still alive. He still lived in town. And Sunday morning, which was tomorrow, was the day that Millhaven gathered. Dorothy spent that night in the root cellar, wrapped in blankets she found folded in her suitcase, reading the letters by flashlight until she had every word memorized. She slept in short intervals, waking to plan, and then sleeping again when planning gave way to exhaustion. Her back ached. The ground was cold. She was 75 years old, and she had not slept on a floor since she was a girl. She had never in her life felt more purposeful. In the early hours of the morning, before the light came, she did the thing she had understood she needed to do from the moment she lifted the dress from the trunk. She worked by flashlight with a small sewing kit from her suitcase, her fingers still precise after 50 years, and she altered the wedding dress. She removed the train. She shortened the back hem. She took the veil completely away. She changed the neckline, not drastically, but enough, adjusting the collar so that it read less as bridal and more as formal, the kind of thing a woman might wear to an occasion that required gravity and intention. She found the old shawl in her suitcase. She had kept it because Frank had given it to her on their 25th anniversary and draped it across her shoulders in a way that completed the effect. When the light was good enough to see clearly, she examined herself in the small, compact mirror she kept in her bag. What she saw was not a woman in a wedding dress. What she saw was a woman dressed for the most important thing she had ever done. She walked the 3 miles back toward town in the early morning light, the letters in her bag, the dress she had made 40 years ago moving around her legs as she walked. Millhaven's Sunday morning fellowship gathered in the town square at 9, before the 10 o'clock service, a tradition that had been in place for as long as Dorothy could remember. Coffee and conversation in the open air when the weather allowed, which in October it barely did, but people came anyway, wrapped in coats, hands around cups. It was the most reliably populated public space in Millhaven's week. Everyone who mattered was there. That was, of course, the point. Dorothy arrived at 8:55. The square was already filling. She moved through it without hurrying, and people saw her, saw the dress, saw the particular quality of her bearing, saw the cloth bag she carried in front of her with both hands like something being brought to an altar. Conversations paused. Heads turned. She heard her name passing from group to group in the way names travel through a crowd that knows you. She saw her children at the edge of the square. Edward had coffee. Patricia was talking to someone from her church group. James was watching Dorothy approach with an expression she could not read. None of them moved toward her. She saw Gerald Holt near the large oak tree at the square's center, which was where he always stood at these events, surrounded by a comfortable orbit of people who found his company reassuring. He was old now, white-haired, slightly bent, but still with that quality of taking up more space than he physically occupied. People were laughing at something he had said. He had not seen her yet. She walked directly toward him. She saw the moment he recognized her. Something moved through his face, controlled immediately, smoothed over, but visible for just that one fraction of a second. Recognition, and beneath it, something older and more fundamental than composure. He knew who she was. He knew what she might be carrying. Dorothy stopped 4 feet from him. The people in his orbit had gone quiet, reading the quality of her arrival, understanding that this was not an accidental encounter. "Reverend Holt," she said. Her voice was clear and carried. "Dorothy," he said. He was working to sound warm, pleased, as if this were an unexpected pleasure. "I didn't know you were. I want to tell this community something that has been waiting 40 years to be said," Dorothy said, speaking to the people around them as much as to him. Something that was prevented from being said at the time by a combination of fear and power, and the calculation that a seamstress's word was not worth as much as a pastor's. The square was quieting in the way of a crowd that recognizes real weight when it appears unexpectedly in front of them. 40 years ago, Dorothy said, "You told the elders of this church that I had come to your office and behaved inappropriately toward you. You said I had propositioned you. You said you had rejected me and that you felt duty-bound to inform the community before I married in your church. You told that story with tears in your eyes, and people believed you, because you were powerful and I was not." Holt's face was working. "Dorothy, I have letters," she said, and she reached into the bag and removed the 3 envelopes, holding them up. 2 of them are from witnesses, people who were there. People who saw and heard what actually happened and documented the truth because they could not live with complete silence, even though they were too afraid of you to speak it publicly at the time. She held up Margaret Fowler's letter. Your own secretary was in the church office that afternoon. She heard you call me in. She heard you through the wall. She heard me refuse you, clearly and repeatedly. She heard me leave. She heard you crafting your lie in your office afterward, practicing the story you were going to tell to the elders. She wrote down everything she witnessed and sent it to my grandmother, because she knew it was true and she couldn't bear for there to be no record. The square was silent now. Not quiet, silent. Coffee cups lowered. Conversations stopped entirely. Arthur Payne, she said, holding up the second letter, witnessed you following me to the church parking lot weeks before the scandal broke publicly. He watched you corner me at my car. He saw you touch my arm when I tried to leave. He saw me push your hand away. He wrote it down and sent it to my grandmother because he knew what he had witnessed and he could not make himself completely silent. She looked at Holt's face. The color had left it entirely. He was holding his coffee cup with both hands. And this, she said, holding up Nana Rose's letter, is from my grandmother, who received both of those letters and who went to the elders to present them and who was then visited by you personally at her home, where you told her, pleasantly and specifically, what you would do to my life and my livelihood if she used them. A sound went through the crowd. Not words. Something under words. I'm not here for revenge, Dorothy said, and she meant it, and the crowd could hear that she meant it. I'm not here to destroy anyone. I am 75 years old, and I have spent 40 years carrying shame I never earned, and I've spent last night in my grandmother's root cellar reading letters that should have been read to this town 4 decades ago. What I want is simple. I want the truth acknowledged. I want it said out loud, here, publicly, in front of the people who were told a lie in this square's church 40 years ago. She turned to Holt directly. Around them, the crowd was perfectly still. Did you lie about me? Did you pursue me when I was engaged to be married? Did you tell those elders the exact opposite of what actually happened because I had refused you and you were angry? Holt was looking at the letters in her hands. He was looking at the crowd, at the faces of people he had known for decades, people who were looking at him now with the particular quality of attention that comes just before a conclusion is reached. He was 78 years old, and he had been carrying this for 40 years. And Dorothy could see in his face the particular exhaustion of a man who has been waiting, without admitting it even to himself, for exactly this moment. Gerald, said a woman's voice from somewhere in the crowd, firm, not unkind. Just tell the truth. The silence stretched. And then Gerald Holt's face changed. Not collapsed. He was not the collapsing kind, even now. But something in it loosened, the way a knot loosens when you find the right end to pull. Yes, he said. His voice was quiet, but the square was so silent that it carried easily. What she has said is true. I pursued her. She refused me. He stopped. Started again. I was a man who was used to having whatever he wanted, and I did not know how to accept being told no by someone I considered beneath my attention. I told the elders a lie. Everything I said about her was a lie. What I said she did to me was what I had actually done to her. He looked at Dorothy, and what was in his face now was not the magnetic charisma she had feared for 40 years. It was just an old man's face carrying something old and heavy. I have thought about you many times, he said. I have told myself many things to make what I did manageable to live with. I have never truly succeeded. Dorothy, I am sorry. I am genuinely, profoundly sorry for what I did to you and to the life you should have had. The crowd around them was entirely motionless. Someone was crying. Dorothy did not look to see who. I accept your apology, Dorothy said. She said it clearly, without hesitation, because she had decided during the long night in the root cellar that this was what she intended to do, not for his sake, but for her own. I have carried what you did to me for 40 years. I'm not going to carry your guilt as well. That belongs to you. But I accept the apology because forgiveness is not something I'm willing to withhold. Not because you deserve it, but because I do. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned to the crowd. I want one thing from all of you, she said. I want it known and remembered and spoken of honestly going forward that Dorothy Callahan was innocent of everything she was accused of in this town. That the life she lived quietly and decently for 40 years was lived under a reputation she never earned. That is all I'm asking. Let the truth be what this town remembers. Then she picked up her bag, turned, and walked out of the square. Behind her, she heard the eruption of voices. She heard her name called, multiple voices, some she recognized and some she didn't. She walked with her head up and the 40-year-old dress moving around her legs and did not turn around until she had crossed the square entirely and was standing on the sidewalk of Jefferson Street, where she stopped and breathed in the cold October air and let herself feel what was happening in her chest, which was not triumph or satisfaction, but something quieter and more permanent. It felt like being set down, like laying down something she had been carrying since she was 36 years old. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. It was James, her youngest, who had followed her out of the square at something close to a run. He was breathing hard and his eyes were wet, and he looked, for the first time in years, like the child she had raised rather than the adult he had become. "Mom," he said. "Mom, I'm so sorry. All these years you were—" "I know," she said. "We never believed." His voice broke. "We grew up hearing about it, and we should have—" "I know," she said again. Edward and Patricia arrived 30 seconds behind him, and they stood on Jefferson Street in the October morning, all five of them, the family that had been broken and was now standing in the rubble of what had broken it. And Dorothy looked at her three children and felt the full, complicated weight of what they were to each other. The love that had not disappeared even through the abandonment. The hurt that was real and could not be pretended otherwise. And the question of what came next that was entirely open. "You put me out of my home," she said. She said it simply, without theater. "You called me a burden. You supervised the removal of my belongings, and you went back to your lives, and you left me to sleep in a root cellar last night." None of them said anything. There was nothing to say. "I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen," Dorothy said. "I'm not going to step over it, because the circumstances have changed, and because I cleared my name publicly, and because it would be convenient for all of us to simply move forward. What you did was wrong. Not just legally or practically wrong. Morally wrong. I raised you, and I loved you, and I needed you, and you chose your comfort over my safety." "We know," Patricia said, and she was crying now, too, without performance. "Mom, we know. We were." She stopped. "There's no excuse." "There isn't one." "No," Dorothy agreed. "There isn't." She looked at them, her three children, who were flawed and who had failed her and who were standing on this sidewalk in the cold, willing to hear this, which was something. "Here is what I want to say to you," Dorothy said. "I want you to think very carefully about the people in your lives who are older than you. Your spouse's parents, your friends' aging relatives, the elderly people in your communities. I want you to think about how easy it is to start seeing someone you love as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be known. It happens gradually. I watched it happen with me. One day, I was your mother, and the next, I was an arrangement that needed to be made. That is what I want you to carry from this. Not guilt. Guilt is useless after a point. Understanding. The understanding of what it costs a person to be seen as inconvenient by the people who are supposed to love them most. Because I guarantee you that every one of us, if we live long enough, will be in the position I was in. And what happens to us will depend entirely on whether the people around us have learned to see us as people." She watched the words land. She watched her children absorb them. "Now," Dorothy said, "where am I sleeping tonight?" Edward let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "With us," he said. "With Linda. I called her this morning, and she already made up the guest room. She said she should have done it months ago." "She's right," Dorothy said. "She should have." "Yes," Edward said. "She should have. We all should have." The weeks that followed moved with a speed that suggested the world had been waiting for something to shift and was now catching up to itself. A local journalist had filmed part of the confrontation in the square on a cell phone. Not all of it, but enough, including Holt's confession, and had posted it online by Sunday afternoon. By Monday morning, it had been picked up by 2 regional news stations and was spreading through the kinds of social media channels where stories about elderly women and 40-year injustices travel quickly and with feeling. A lawyer named Thomas Briggs called Dorothy on Tuesday. He was from Charlottesville, had seen the story, and was calling to offer his services pro bono. He explained, carefully and clearly, that Holt's public admission constituted evidence in a civil case for defamation and the economic harm that had followed. The lost business, the social isolation, the lifetime of diminished opportunity. He believed the case had significant merit. Dorothy thought about it overnight. She was not a litigious person by nature. She did not want to spend the last years of her life in courtrooms. But she was also 75 and living out of a suitcase, and principle was easier to maintain when you were not worried about where you were sleeping. File it, she told Thomas Briggs on Wednesday morning. Holt did not contest it. His lawyer reached out within the week. The settlement negotiations were brief. Holt was 78 and in poor health and apparently, in the weeks since the confrontation, had told his family the full truth of what he had done, which had produced within his household a reckoning that Dorothy did not need to know the details of. The settlement was completed in 6 weeks. It was not a spectacular sum, but it was more than enough. Enough to buy a small house outright. Enough to live without financial fear for the rest of her life. Enough to leave something to her grandchildren. Dorothy bought a cottage on Maple Lane, on the eastern edge of Millhaven, 2 bedrooms and a proper sewing room with good north light, and a garden in the back that she intended to fill with the roses she had always meant to plant. She set up her alterations work again, and this time, when she opened the door of the shop she had rented on Crescent Street, a different unit than the original, but the same street, people came not with whispers and sideways glances, but with apologies and genuine warmth, and occasionally with the particular quality of attention that people bring when they want to be in the presence of someone who did something that mattered. She hung the wedding dress on the wall of the sewing room. Not as a reminder of pain. She had thought about this carefully and decided that was not what she wanted. She hung it as the record of her own work, the most careful thing she had made, the thing that had held truth in its lining for 40 years and survived. Every time she sat down at her sewing table, she could look at it and remember that good work lasts, that evidence preserved with love and intention can survive longer than anyone expects, and that the people who take things from you are rarely able to take everything. The relationship with her children rebuilt itself slowly and imperfectly, which was the only honest way it could have rebuilt. Edward and Patricia and James came to her, not to be forgiven in a dramatic scene, but simply, regularly, with the ordinary consistency of people who are trying to demonstrate over time what they had failed to demonstrate when it mattered. They called. They came for dinner. They asked her questions and waited for the answers. They introduced her to their children with the pride of people who had recently understood something they should have understood much earlier. There were hard conversations. Dorothy did not spare them those. She said clearly and plainly, on more than one occasion, what it had cost her to be treated as she had been treated, and she said it not to wound them, but because she believed, with the conviction of someone who had spent 40 years paying the price for silence, that the truth spoken directly was the only foundation on which anything real could be built. They listened. They did not always respond well immediately, but they came back and they tried again, which Dorothy had decided to accept as sufficient evidence of good faith. 6 months after the confrontation in the town square, on a Saturday morning in April, Dorothy was in her garden planting the first of the rose bushes she had bought at the nursery in town. The soil was cold but workable, the way Virginia soil is in early spring, reluctant but not impossible. She was on her knees with her gardening gloves, making a proper hole when she heard the gate. She looked up. It was Patricia who had driven down that morning and who was standing at the gate with a look on her face that was somewhere between determined and uncertain. The look of a person who has decided to say something that is going to cost her something. "I've been thinking about what you said," Patricia said, "about seeing people, about how easy it is to stop seeing someone as a person. Dorothy waited. I think I stopped seeing you, Patricia said. I think I was so focused on, I don't know, on the inconvenience, on the logistics, on keeping my own life running the way I needed it to run. I stopped seeing you as a person who needed me to actually look at her. She stopped. I'm sorry, Mom. Not for the practical failures, though those too, but for that, for stopping seeing you. Dorothy looked at her daughter, who was standing at the garden gate on a Saturday morning in April, having driven 45 minutes to say this thing. She looked at her the way she looked at fabric, honestly, without wishful thinking. What she saw was someone trying. Come help me plant these roses, Dorothy said. Patricia came through the gate and knelt in the soil beside her mother. And they worked in the April morning without speaking for a while, and the silence between them had a different quality than it had 6 months ago. It was the silence of people who are relearning something they should never have forgotten. She saved them, you know, Dorothy said after a while. Nana rose. She kept those letters for 40 years. She kept the dress. She put the key in my hand on the last day of her life and asked me to promise I'd remember. She knew you'd need them, Patricia said. She knew I might need them, Dorothy said. She didn't know what for or when. She just loved me enough to prepare for the possibility that I might one day be in a situation where I had nothing and needed the truth to fight with. That's what real love does. It prepares for the dark. Patricia was quiet for a moment, pressing soil around the base of a rose bush. I should have been that for you, she said. We should have been that for you. Instead of the people you needed to fight against, we should have been the people who were preparing the root cellar. Dorothy looked at her daughter. Yes, she said, you should have. And now you know that. And the question from here is what you do with knowing it. She pressed her own rose bush gently into the earth, firming the soil around it with both gloved hands. That's the thing about truth, Dorothy said. It doesn't need you to do anything with it right away. It just needs you to know it. The work comes after. The roses would bloom in June, their first season in new soil, and Dorothy would be there to see them. She would be there in this garden, in this house she had bought with 40 years' worth of vindication. In this life she had reclaimed in the last act of a story that most people would have said was finished long ago. She would be there because she had opened a locked door and read the letters her grandmother had sealed away with love and a cameo ring, and carried the truth into the town square on a Sunday morning in a dress she had made 40 years ago with her own hands. And because some things, the things made carefully, the things preserved with intention, the things sealed against the weather until the moment they're truly needed, do not rot with time. They wait. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below what part of Dorothy's journey stayed with you. Whether it was the moment she broke the wax seal, the morning she walked into the town square, or the quiet Saturday in the garden where something began to heal. We believe stories like this one matter because they remind us that the people we love deserve to be seen, truly seen, not managed, not arranged, not reduced to the inconvenience they might occasionally represent. If this story has moved you and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter we're preparing for you.